The world is divided into 4 spheres, each sphere divided among continents and nations. Nations are divided by borders and interests. These interests divide the news. We examine the impact of these divisions on people and power. This is Imaginary Lines. Welcome to the program. I'm your host, Michael Fox. The U.S. state of California is in the midst of its worst drought in 1,200 years. The snowpack in the Sierra Nevada mountains is at a record low, and already more than a dozen towns in the Central Valley are at risk of drying out. I speak with Mateo Nube, co-founder of the Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project based in Oakland, California, about the drought, the effect on local communities, and the politics behind the government response. But first, let's take a look at media in Latin America. On Sunday, June 7th, Mexico was witness to one of the most violent and chaotic elections the region has seen in decades. Social movements, particularly those in southern states including Guerrero and Oaxaca, had made it known that they would not allow the election to proceed. Activists burned party offices, destroyed ballots, and prevented access to some polling locations. In total, 415 voting stations had to be closed, and there were reports of multiple deaths at the hands of state security forces. Officials were forced to annul elections in the town of Tixla in Guerrero, the same state where 43 students from the Ayotzinapa Teacher Training College were forcibly disappeared in September. Family members of the disappeared participated in the actions, affirming that the elections would only serve to legitimize a political system that is closely tied to organized crime. Yet no mainstream media outlet led with the disorder that characterized the elections. Reuters, the BBC, and the New York Times audaciously stated the election was largely peaceful. The claim was also made by the Organization of American States Observer Mission, which had to suspend their work in the state of Oaxaca due to insecurity. Corporate media love Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto. Time magazine even put him on their cover in February 2014 with the headline, "Saving Mexico." But as Peña Nieto's administration has bounced from scandal to scandal, that cover is starting to look more and more like a joke. The problem, however, is that the Mexican people aren't laughing. The drought in California is hitting the state hard. The state's Central Valley yields 1/3 of all produce grown in the United States, but it is now lined with dried crops and scorched valleys. Earlier this year, California Governor Jerry Brown instituted the state's first mandatory water reductions, mandating cities to reduce water usage by 25% by the end of the year. But the move has drawn flack for asking residents to conserve without mandating water cutbacks for big agriculture, hydraulic fracking, and bottling plants of companies such as Nestle. Mateo Nube has worked in the labor, environmental justice, and international solidarity movements. He's a co-founder of the Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project based in Oakland, California. Mateo, thanks so much for joining me on Imaginary Lines. For those of our viewers that might not know the situation presently in California around the drought, climate change, can you paint that picture for us? What's happening on the ground?
Absolutely, absolutely. So in the material conditions in California as they relate to water are quite dramatic. California's snowpack is now at a record low. That means the snow we have in the Sierras, which is like our savings account, particularly for the summer, is 12% of normal. And that's less than half of last year's. It's as if half of our savings account simply vanished. And one way to think about it is that we in California, we simply aren't organized to handle home without snow. So there's just a lot less water to go around. So that's kind of the conditions materially speaking. And then there is kind of how water is allocated and what it is currently being used for. That is really the political question at hand.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about what the drought means for residents across the state, everyday folks, workers, and communities?
I think folks in rural communities are really starting to feel it. You know, working class folks in very small rural communities that are linked to agriculture or where there are fracking wells are really seeing their aquifers, their groundwater simply disappear. So that right now is the front line of folks literally starting to face a reality without daily water. But the truth is that in an urban context, and most people in California live in cities, it still is more of a rhetorical reality than, oh my God, I don't have access to water kind of reality. So we're kind of at that threshold.
What is the state doing in this situation of severe drought? How is it confronting the crisis?
That's a great question, and it depends on how you look at it. In the last month, the governor, Jerry Brown, dictated that cities had to cut down use by 25%, which on the surface, some folks would say that's a decent start. But what isn't happening is there is no reorganization of economy happening. And what I mean by that is that, when I was talking about the banks and tanks economy, there are very useful indicators we can use to see if economy is going well or not. And there are very not useful ways to measure that. What do I mean by that? Economy simply means management of home. It's not GDP. It's not financial markets. Those are just tools of a particular kind of economy, right? The governor has done nothing to question the growth economy, has done nothing to question wealth as the central driver of the California economy, and has done nothing to say, for example, how we measure the health and well-being of our watersheds and our soil and the peoples who live in California should be central to the economy. Why am I saying all of that? Because we're still seeing humongous developments happening for mega rich folks to live with golf courses and big swimming pools. That isn't stopping in California or across the Southwest. And for example, the biggest consumer of water in California is alfalfa. Alfalfa is the superfood for cows. It takes something like 750 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of milk. A lot of the alfalfa being grown in California is actually going to feed cows in China due to the growth of the red meat diet in China. So here we start seeing the illogic of the current economy that isn't being challenged at all, and the consequences, which I can talk about in a second, who is going to bear the brunt of this crisis is again a central political question that is not being tackled at all by the state, by Jerry Brown, by the government here in California.
Right, and I imagine that this has a direct effect on workers. Can you speak to the effect on migrant workers in particular in this crisis?
Sure. I mean, it's always very complex, and one of the things that is happening is that farming is contracting in some arenas of California. Really, what is happening is the percentage of land that is being tilled is decreasing, and yet farmers are moving more and more into luxury commodity crops that are highly profitable, like almonds, like the alfalfa that I mentioned before. And the truth is that even though water prices are going up for farmers, the cost of water for big farmers in California relative, say, to labor is minimal. And yet the cost is being placed on the back of workers. And so that's happening for farm workers. Farm workers are struggling with owners suddenly saying, bosses saying, we're going to have to pay you less. And it's actually having a ripple effect in different sectors, say in the hospitality industry, hotel workers, people who use hotels are seeing these little signs that say, hey, we're a green hotel. Throw your towel on the ground only if you want it washed. If not, we won't wash it for 2-3 days. And it's being presented as like, hey, we're water friendly. But really what they're trying to do is cut labor costs and trying to hire less folks and trying to make folks who work in hotels clean more rooms per day. And that's kind of, again, the interesting way that the economy is responding to this is not by really trying to figure out how do we reorganize the economy to take care of our watersheds and the people who live in it, but it's still all orienting towards wealth and profit and accumulation.
Let's talk about water usage and water ownership. Who owns water and for what means?
There's a couple of different questions, big questions that we're needing to wrestle with. And one is this conception of water as private property versus water as part of the commons. Clearly, we're in a situation where there's a lot less water to go around. And, to borrow a phrase in Spanish that is very useful, like, we need to be prioritizing el bien común. the common good. We need to figure out, okay, there's a lot less water. What is the most effective, efficient way of using water such that we keep on regenerating the water over time, the 7 generations concept, that we use it in a way that feeds our soils in a way that replenish rather than diminish, and that are distributed in an equitable way so that all folks who need water receive it to meet true needs. And that kind of the concept of excess be removed from the equation. So one of the things that we have to figure out, not only in California, but all over the world, is how do we remove the concept of private and privatization from not only water management, but water ownership. And that's what we would say needs to be on the table. And what that ultimately should lead to is to folks living in place in an equitable way, determining what is the responsible way to use and distribute water. And that's not currently happening.
So it's pretty evident that change doesn't come without a social movement. Can you paint a picture for us right now about what this looks like on the ground in California?
That's a great question. I think you're getting to the thrust of the political reality that we're not going to get to an equitable management and distribution of water without a political fight. We are at a place where at Movement Generation, we sometimes refer to it as resilience-based organizing, where communities are faced with the necessary challenge of deploying our own labor to meet our own needs. Folks who live in place are actually the folks who have a best capacity to read what is the best way to engage with my watershed and my food shed and my energy shed, and what's the most democratic way for us to decide how to manage home, how to relate to place so that our needs are met in a dignified way, and such management happens so that we and our kids and our grandkids will actually have a dignified future, even in knowing that, or particularly knowing that difficult times are ahead. Because we know that the Nestles and the Bechtels and the Halliburtons, they have absolutely no interest in safeguarding the water future of California. It's people living in California who care about the well-being of their kids and their grandkids in every single community. So we are at a place where we need to be forming these social movements that put equity and racial justice at the center, and that really root our organizing around ecological systems thinking, which means appreciating what do we need to do to take proper care of home? How do we return to right relationship with place so that we understand our watershed and know how to care for it so that it's there for us and we are there for it over the course of a long arc of time.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mateo, for joining me on Imaginary Lines. And now let's take a look at international media. The expiration of sections of the U.S. Patriot Act last month was met with enthusiasm from privacy advocates and defenders of civil liberties. The Patriot Act, passed shortly after the September 11th attacks, provided much of the legal justification for the mass surveillance conducted by U.S. intelligence agencies. Even Edward Snowden, the former NSA contractor and whistleblower who exposed the extent of U.S. spying, welcomed the news, penning an op-ed in the New York Times that attributed this development to an informed public and a change in global awareness. However, whatever jubilation the public felt at news that mass surveillance was coming to an end was quickly quashed with the passage of the Freedom Act only days later. USA Today led with the headline, "NSA data collection ended," but that is far from the truth. While the legislation was billed as an effort to protect privacy, it in many ways facilitates the same mass surveillance authorized under the Patriot Act. The same data will still be collected, only it will be held in phone company computers rather than the NSA's networks. The NSA will still have access to the data, but it will have to be authorized from a court by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA. This, according to Jim Narekas, the editor of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, is essentially a rubber stamp that operates in secret. In a recent article, Narekas cited NSA whistleblower J. Kirk Wiebe, who called the new system, quote, more of a psychological maneuver to make us all feel good than a true constraint. It's obvious that this reincarnation of the Patriot Act is no way forward for a country that has shown it has no interest in respecting the civil liberties of even its own citizens. That's it for today's program. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Michael Fox. Please join me next week.